Well, I wanted to welcome everybody both in person and virtually. My name is Lyons. I am the CFA Society President, and I'm excited to be here with Casey. I'm glad she's going to be presenting. She has a long history in the industry and as a leader for change, starting the Women's Forum at NEPC in 2013 and championing the DEI efforts throughout the industry as well. So really looking forward to hearing the perspective and her thoughts on the consultancy role that she's been experienced in. And thanks for everybody for supporting the CFA Society. We have a number of sponsors that are on one of the slides.
I will turn that off right now and share it.
And one of those, Pete Swanson, your firm is a sponsor. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And anybody that I don't know who's on the call as a sponsor, thank you for helping to support society and continue to bring great content to our members. And with that, Casey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So this is my first presentation where it's hybrid. Actually, it's my first in person in a long time. So bear with me. I was even joking I brought paper with me today. I'm so used to having multiple monitors like we all are at home. I even showered for everybody. So I'm already kind of back into the real world. One of the things on this that is different is because it's hybrid. You know, we were always used to being all in person or all hybrid. So I'm going to try to make sure I look at people who have the cameras on and see if there's reactions or anything that I need to be thinking about, and if you want to speak or speak up, as well as the room. So just so you know. And then I also noticed that in this group, it is about 1/3 asset owners, and it is about 2/3 asset managers. I want to make sure that I'm not at the level where you guys are like, oh my gosh, we know all this already, and I want to make sure I tailor the remarks to why you're here today, why you wanted to come, what did you want to hear. So I would just open it up first, and this is for the folks on Zoom as well. Please speak up, and if you're shy, you could put it in the comments box. Mark, I have a luxury. My husband has never offered to help run a Zoom meeting for me before, so I have a luxury today if Mark is actually going to be watching for comments. And but you know, speak up as well. So I'll open it up first. Why are you here? What do you want to learn today, or what do you want to get to know more about today?
Yes, I'll start with looking for more options in terms of investments and in the screening for diversity and inclusion in the socially responsible portfolio.
Okay.
This is Karen Flores from the Minneapolis Foundation. This is something we're very interested in and working towards. So always happy to get new ideas and generate some new thoughts about it.
Thank you, Karen. Others?
Casey, I'm curious just to learn about what are the most important things that asset allocators are looking at as they do drive decision making.
Okay.
You know, it seems like an important trend over the last few years.
This is Mackenzie Willems with the Market A. Cargill Philanthropies, and I'm particularly interested in pipeline building of not only diverse managers, but possibly even investments that invest in diverse-owned businesses.
Okay. Any others?
Hey, Casey, it's Rochelle from HRK. I'm so glad you're doing this. We're hoping to incorporate DEI objectives into our investment policy statement. So I'm looking for really big picture, what others are doing, what makes sense to include, what's, you know, sort of a reasonable place to start. I know there's a lot of aspiration, and I think to the prior questioner's comment about pipeline, you know, so I'm just here to soak up all of the great ideas from my amazing peers in the Twin Cities on this topic.
So I think that actually, Rochelle, thank you. That you just raised something I think is going to be really important, and that is that I think sharing on this will be important to understand context of what other people are doing, and if there's other great ideas, that people always have good ideas that maybe we haven't thought of. And then as it relates to pipeline building and thinking through different opportunities on that, I do have examples or in the back slides from our firm of what we've done, because our traditional way of doing this, we felt needed to be supplemented if we were going to be successful in this. But I kept them in the appendix because I know we're not here today for an advertisement about what we're doing. So I thought I would keep it, but we can definitely go into that, Mackenzie, as well. So, perfect. Good. Well, this is the slide of all the sponsors. So thank you, sponsors. We really do appreciate all the support on this. Let's just go down and go to the next piece here. Let me make sure that my mouse is, there we go. So the goal here was to talk about how it can strengthen your portfolio. And, you know, what I began with, and all of us probably are somewhat believers, frankly, if we're here, if we self-selected into this. But I think it's not a surprise to us at all that when we look at this from our industry standpoint, we are, on one hand, we're hearing so much about this, that we're thinking, wow, there must be just lots out there, right? And in fact, 50% of our clients have some sort of DEI initiative or integration in their portfolio. And for those people who are not familiar with my firm, NEPC covers really all the institutional investing market segments as well as private wealth. So that gives you some context, and I'll be talking about that, the different areas and business opportunities associated with that. Having said that, while everyone's talking about it, while we have this percentage, the reality is that it's incredibly small in the investment industry. When we're looking at this, and what is shown up here on the screen, is that only 10%, for example, or 9% of women or minority, respectively, you know, and that's just the sheer number of funds in these various different areas, like, for example, on mutual funds. When you look at the size of assets, it's minuscule. There is a real opportunity here for us to make a big difference and a big impact. And a part of this is because of just, yes, there might be more volume of managers, and I would argue it's still dramatically lower than it should be, but also they tend to be smaller asset sizes. So we need to be thinking about this and thinking about, you know, what can we do as part of this? We also should be asking the question why. And by the way, the reason that question on why is in part why we've instituted an additional discovery platform for our firm to be able to, in fact, find managers in a different way. And some of the impediments that exist here are absolutely structural. So they're operational based, they're compliance based. I think we all know that if we're in this industry, we know that what we've had to do from compliance, operations, all of that, in some cases, has become very costly and very onerous to just even begin that. The other piece to this, other than kind of regulatory, is frankly opportunity and networking. We all know that networking is critically important. And the opportunity to get in front of institutional investors, I don't think we think of ourselves this way, but we're a pretty clubby group. And that if we don't have an advocate or someone who is ready to advocate for us overall, it's hard to kind of break in. Once you break in and you're, you know, the favorite child, that's great. But before that, it's very, very difficult to break in. The other piece to this is that we have bias built into our system. So what are we requiring? And I'll talk about the bias, and I'll talk about, for example, rules that we put in place that we thought were best practices, but really do inhibit those without a large kind of backer to be able to enter this industry and to be successful in the industry. So those are all things to be thinking about. So the next thing I will talk about is one of my favorites, the myth. Okay, so no matter what, I promise you that the first time I talk to clients about this, or sometimes I get pulled aside, even for clients who are already embracing it. So they're embracing it, and they have a committee member who pulls me aside and wants me to know that at the end of the day, their responsibility is to earn a return. So they cannot give up, you know, they cannot give up stuff for this kind of diversity thing. Okay. So, so you're going to hear this. That is a myth. So investors need to choose between returns or diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it has been busted. And by the way, how often do you get to use art in the investment industry in a PowerPoint presentation? So I'm really happy with that. So that was my thrill for the day. So looking at this, the Knight Foundation really came out in 2017, and if you're not familiar with the study, there was effectively, it was the one that put the stake in the ground, and there has been subsequent studies that have been just proven this, and in fact teased it out even more, and that is that diverse-owned, minority-owned firms do not, in fact, underperform anyone else. And in fact, they perform really statistically exactly like every other humanoid that is managing money performs during this time period. So there is no real performance differential associated between a diverse-owned firm and a non-minority-owned firm. So that was pretty significant as we are looking at this. And in fact, when they looked at the distribution, the performance was almost like identical on this. In fact, the minority in some cases came out a little bit ahead, but not statistically significant enough. So it's fair to say that from a population standpoint, that we're really not seeing any differences, but that is not the perception of institutional investors. The other piece that actually was in this that I thought was really interesting too, and it speaks to bias, is that they looked at when a manager gets fired for underperformance. And if a manager gets fired for underperformance for a minority-owned firm gets fired far earlier, has far less runway to underperform than a traditional manager who usually gets a year or two when they're underperforming. So that's great for us to know because it's an unconscious bias that we may have as committee members, as consultants, where we were already a little nervous about this. We might have gone into it thinking we were going to get lesser return, and then we make it self-fulfilling prophecy because we fire them when they're down instead of appreciating that there's a natural ebb and flow to investing, and frankly, it goes against our guts, but that's when you should stick with the manager oftentimes, is when we're seeing underperformance, and God forbid, even give them more money. And so I think this is all interesting, and I think we can put to bed, this is just the landmark study. There's been so many more studies on this, on diversity owned. What I'm going to tell you later is that, in fact, diversely integrated firms in leadership and decision-making actually outperform non-diverse. So the difference between what I'm telling you now is these are just whether you own the firm or you don't own the firm versus how have you integrated diversity across your firm, okay? So the next piece is that let's just talk about the business case for the asset owners. So here's the business case for asset owners. And what I've done is I've actually just faded out the ones that may not be the primary drivers for asset owners. But as you're looking at this, you know, performance and risk mitigation. So we're showing that integrated diverse firms actually outperform. So they are about 30 basis points higher in outperformance than non-diversely integrated organizations. So that's pretty important. Think about that. 30 basis points. I mean, I think there's many days I would kill for 2 or 3 more basis points over certain things, right? Like, and so that's substantive. The other aspect to this is risk mitigation. What they have found is not only is that 30 basis points higher, but the standard deviation or the variation is much lower in a diverse-owned firm, or a diverse integrated firm as part of this. The next is that from a fiduciary responsibility, you have an obligation to provide the best investments for the best interest for the outcomes. And this goes from pension to, you know, I recognize fiduciary concept is more in endowments and foundations, but it really covers that gamut that this is a responsibility that you need to pursue. And if there were almost any other thing that you said, I can earn extra return, you would pursue this because, in part, because it's a good business strategy to do so. Talent engagement. I cannot believe the ramp up in the need for talent and how expensive talent is for us. And I think we're all seeing this in the investment industry right now. And so we want the best talent. And what we have found is that having a very inclusive environment means that people can show up, be creative, and be their authentic selves at work actually produces better outcomes. So it's a way to have talent and have alignment of talent. And then, of course, for the asset owners, it's a reflection of your values and what you want to accomplish. And I'm going to show you examples that are from clients that one was corporate, one is healthcare, and one is foundation endowment. So this is not just philanthropy that is thinking about this going forward. From an asset manager, it only gets better. And this is the business case. So I have to ask, you know, as we're looking at the amount of assets going into this, and I'll talk about why now we're actually seeing money move versus what we've been seeing up to this point in this area, how often do any of us get to have a brand new market to break into? Okay, I just want to be thinking about that for a minute. How many times in your career do you get that, right? Our industry is pretty stable. There's very few pockets of growing wealth, except in the area of probably private wealth and private foundations as an outcome of private wealth. So this is a real opportunity to be thinking about how you can break into another market, how you can actually differentiate yourself as part of this. Of course, it's, you know, the performance, the fiduciary, the talent is all there, and the values. But really, there's a couple different things. There's the branding. This allows you to actually think about how to differentiate yourself, how to attract people that really want to be a part of this, and your business outcomes are better. So remember that what I was saying about performance, 30 basis points better, that's on like a company basis. That can be you as well. So there's real value in all of those pieces as we're looking forward. And then this is just to give you some feel for the reason I'm hearing from our clients what's the motivation for this, and then what client types are the ones that we're typically seeing in this area. So we're seeing, first of all, they believe that it reflects their population, meaning their own employees, and what they want to do as part of their employees, and it reflects the population they serve. So one of the biggest drivers I've seen in my healthcare clients is they have realized they get better health outcomes when they actually reflect the communities in which they serve, and it actually affects the health outcomes. And so they've chosen to do this across the whole organization, their investment portfolios being one of them. So I think that's really interesting and really important as we think about that. Now, client type. You know, and Karen made some great points like early on in this, like when I first did the first survey on impact investing, for example, this was like 2012, everyone was like, what the heck is impact investing? Like, there wasn't even a good nomenclature around this stuff, right? And oftentimes, I felt like this is more, people view me as being the bleeding heart on some of this. I want to let you know that as we're looking at this on segments, it is affecting every single segment that we pretty much serve. So pension plans are now looking at this. If you didn't see the DOL announcement that came out yesterday morning, that was pretty important. And of course, we have Judy Maris, a wonderful person in our own community who is working on that as well. And so that is wonderful in that piece of it. Public funds. Public funds are an area where they are absolutely they've always had pressure to do this, but I feel like they've had pressure to do this and they almost had to check the box because they actually had to do it, but there wasn't a good game plan. I'm seeing it integrated much more and a much higher awareness. Obviously, this is philanthropic, so this is, I would view as the endowments and foundations. And I think there's some really exciting things. And some of the pieces that we're thinking about is how can it be more comprehensive than just investing in a diverse-owned firm. And Mackenzie, I think some of the points you raised on how maybe it's about incorporating racial equity in a more meaningful manner in multiple ways, other than just hiring someone who is a minority who owns the firm, is something that I think there's a big movement afoot, and we are looking for opportunities for that. Healthcare I already mentioned, and Taft-Hartley. Taft-Hartley is the one where most people are like, well, union plans definitely are not going to be into this. That is absolutely wrong. So just in case you're not aware that the demographic of union plans has dramatically shifted to actually Latinos, Latinx, I guess is better, Latinx and women overall. So what they are starting to say is that, again, remember I said reflecting the population, and people are ending up in leadership, and they're starting to recognize that this is a value for their members. The last but not least is there's not a speech probably that's been done in the last 5 years without millennials somewhere in the speech. So I just felt I need to throw it in here. So from a demographic standpoint, millennials identify and want to have this as meaning in their life, and in fact to do something that is right and good, and they want to align their investing and their influence with their values as part of this. If you are a retail investor, if you have retail opportunities, you need to sit up and take note. So this quote, that 73% said they would agree, somewhat or strongly agree that they would invest their portfolio that are providing opportunities for advancement of women and diverse groups is really, really important. I will also tell you that millennials are becoming my clients, and they are putting their dollars, their money, where their mouth is effectively, and that is valuable, and that is so important for us moving forward on that. So I've armed you with the stats. I know you're probably all believers, but hopefully you have some sound bites that you can carry the message to your respective organizations on some of these items. I'm going to talk about how we actually start working with clients and managers on this, but before I do, are there questions or comments or observations that you've had in this that anyone wants to share in this?
I think one of the toughest things I have on the on the high net worth side is defining some of this impact for the, because everybody seems to have a different prioritization of stuff. Everybody wants to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive, but they focus on different priorities.
What it means.
Yeah, what it means.
I think I would absolutely agree with that. And part of it is that I would say that having worked with my private wealth clients, and I get to lead the private wealth business side, they had the hardest time. And the reason why I think they have the hardest time is because a corporation probably already has a mission and a vision statement, which has already identified who they want to be, what their intention is. And so when the next step is not debating what this exactly means to them, whereas families have not always created their family mission statement or values in the same manner. And so they're starting kind of in a much more amorphous state. And so beginning with what the mission and the intention is probably the biggest amount of time that we spend doing it. And then once we do that, that's great. And what you'll also find too is, like, for example, I had a family that I was working with that they were against child labor, of course, and modern slavery. And they wanted to find investment opportunities for this. It's really hard. You know what's going to invest? There's not an investment opportunity in that. In that situation, there might be much more about negative screening or shareholder activism as opposed to an investment return generating market level return. Okay, but there are definitely other areas which you absolutely could. So, for example, I have a client that is looking for a lower impact for natural resources. And it helped them as well, and that is that they found a way to invest and whether you could sanitize M95 masks and turn them around so that they were reducing their carbon footprint, which was one of their primary goals for this. And it turned out that from a PPE standpoint, they didn't have the shortfall that others had. But as part of their investment, they ended up making quite a bit of money on that. That turned out to be a great market rate of return for them and aligned with them operationally. And so. Other comments? Okay. So let's talk about what we do when we go through this and how we start with clients. So first of all, it has to be authentic. It has to, and when I said mission and vision, this is exactly. So an interesting thing is on one of these, there's a footprint that actually, or a footnote that actually says for one of our clients where some of the words they're taking out is coming right out of their strategic plan. Okay, so and that by the way was a health system. So they're looking at this and they're saying, look, this is what we really care about. They have almost a mission or vision statement associated with it, and it is authentic to who they are and how they are throughout the organization. I've included here, for example, that we actually go through and we identify for us what that looks like for us as well, because unless it's across the organization, it is not effective. This is not a bolt-on strategy. So I would say that if you're looking to implement this, or if you're a manager, you should want to actually see this with your, to ask about it, because oftentimes this is part of the communication that people want to do, but that might be off their radar. The next thing is, and my daughter and I actually talked about this a little bit, and I'll share a part of this, but that is that, stakeholders. We have to recognize that we have a lot of stakeholders. This is not just about either the beneficiaries or your committee. This is everybody. So if you are, for example, like the Minneapolis Foundation or others that are relying upon donations or are even at, looking at others who might have a vested interest in how it's being invested, they need to be on board. They need to know why. Why are you doing this? How is it going to benefit them? It's kind of interesting. My daughter, who works for a competitor, and I were talking this past weekend, and I was talking about the business case of DEI. And she was like, this drives me crazy that you have to have a business case for DEI. It's not enough that it is being equitable and fair to a population and that, but instead you have to show people it will make the money. The reality is you need to meet your stakeholders where they are, and you need to show their value proposition. And so as you're thinking through this, there's some value. So I thought this was kind of interesting as we're looking at this. So, up here I have where diversity matters. And, as I'm looking at diversity matters on this, I am, the client is looking at this and citing, look, performance is higher, there's better risk mitigation. So they were actually able to say, this is what I want to see in this, right? And this is of value to them as part of it. The next piece is that, the racial equity investing. This is one that I actually really like, and the reason I like it is because, the what and why. They talk in the first paragraph about what they would like to see from, from their mission, from their organization. But the second one, they actually start to say that, look, this has economic value for all of us, right? Closing this gap is going to create for us a better market, a better environment, and this is something we should all want to see as part of this. I just thought this was a great way to say yes, acknowledging different viewpoints of why this has economic value for all of us. The next piece is that, looking at how it's integrated without the firm, like, okay, so there's different people who care differently about this. So some people look to say, is your leadership, is it about employees, is it about your clients? And that we've chosen to say, how is it affecting all of the stakeholders that are part of our organization? And then the other piece, this continuum of advancements, this was actually something that was part of the organization was thinking about how are they in the community and how do they attract workers as part of the community. So to give you an idea, this continuum of advancement, this is a client who actually helps gives loans for education for minority groups, and then will forgive the loan if they come work for them for 3 years afterwards. Okay, so that they are providing an opportunity, they're providing and they're filling their workforce, and they're trying to promote people for joining them as part of this. That was just part of their operation. That wasn't part of their investment. So for them, it was a pretty natural step to go to their investment piece and start to look at it. So, let's look at what the journey looks like for us. When we start working with a client, we recognize that there's different stages to this. And when the different stages, it looks very linear. It actually is often, there's a lot of loop backs on this. So first there's the learning, and it's talking about, how investments perpetuate inequality at times and what we can do to change that. One of the great questions is, that foundations and endowments are asking themselves is that they're distributing, depends, but 5% of their assets, right? Are 95% of their assets doing the harm that their grants are trying to fix? Okay, so how can they step back and begin to look at this, to appreciate how can they use their entire balance sheet to start to have influence on what they want to see and how they want to do this? The next is building consensus. So, you need to begin to say, well, what tools in our toolbox are we okay using? So this is what investment strategies are we willing to use as part of this, and what does that mean? What does it look like? How are we thinking about that? Putting it into your investment policy, that update and evaluate. Putting in your investment policy with a hard target is something that I haven't seen happen until this year, and this is why real money is going into this space. Okay, and I will go through why baselines have become very, very important. The next piece is we're learning and we're going to make mistakes. And as part of that, you should be building in flexibility. So that sometimes can be a challenge. We often think of a policy instead of being a rule book. The policy are guardrails, okay? And what we're going to find along the way is that if we're trying to reach a destination, we might end up with a detour. We need to step back. We need to learn and figure out what might be a better way to retool this. That is a hard concept for some committee members, okay? So it's something that should be stated up front, and it should be something that is part of it. As a manager going into this, saying, we want to be a partner with you, and that this is going to be an evolution. So from an asset manager standpoint, they can be dinged by people like me. They're like, oh, you changed your process? Oh my gosh, oh, you changed your process, and it's just been drilled in us by CFA, I'll even put that up, that this is a best practice, that we want to see consistency and philosophy process, you don't want them kind of chasing their tail. This is an area, because we're learning, that we should constantly be refining our process. I'm not saying that we have to change it wholesale, but I do think having some sort of recognition that it can constantly improve has got to be important. It's got to be part of the communication all along the way. The invest and engage. Here is where we really have the power. One, looking at this and saying, this is what we want, and and putting our money where our mouth is. So starting to do it at all levels, right? So you hire an investment consultant, you should be asking them, what are they doing in their organization? What are they doing across for the firm? What does it look like? What does diversity look like for you, right? Next should be, and by the way, what are you doing to actually do this for real with managers and then with underlying companies? Managers, you should be asking the same questions. It should be, what are they doing in their own organization, but then also how are they carrying that as they are assessing companies that they choose to invest in? And it may not be that they're screening it out, mind you. I don't want to suggest that. As much as they are identifying, they're asking the question and they're putting this out there as an assessment when they're evaluating. And last but not least is the companies themselves. So, and then iterate and share. So, you know, we're learning. We're going to go back and we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep improving. And what I have actually seen is I have 2 clients that just hired us because they carved out a small portion of their portfolio to do ESG and DEI. They've been doing that, they've been learning, and now they want to integrate it across their entire portfolio. Okay, and so it's going to be a constant learning process as part of this, and then sharing with everybody that this is part of this, posting this on your website, having this be part of not just supplemental materials, but for what you do with your clients. So execution. Let's talk about what this looks like. And just so you know, we have chosen to take the DEI, approaching DEI using our impact taxonomy as we're looking at this. So when we're looking at this, we're thinking that there's different ways to do this. And I think that this is getting into your point of screening, right? But all the way to the other side of the equation where, Mackenzie, you were raising, you know, like thinking through how do we get through this and how do we use what are our intentions and how can we use influence in different areas. So the negative screening, I think we're all familiar with the negative screening as part of this, and that would be that if you wanted to rule out those that were, in this case, not embracing or had bad business practices associated with it. The next piece is that you're actually choosing, so this is the ESG DEI integration, you're actually choosing to engage with people who will partner with you where they value this and they have this integrated into their process, both within the organization of how they run their business and how they are looking to invest in their business. The thematic is where you are actually starting to see programs that are really designed to specifically address this. So a great example on the difference between integration and thematic. Integration would be, for example, you ask me, what are you as an organization doing to invest or to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in your own organization and to be advocates for this, right? The next piece on thematic is that you're actually making a choice to invest with minority-owned organizations and those that are targeting minority economic challenges that might exist out there. And at last but not least is shareholder engagement, where you're actually going to companies, you're actually engaging and asking for them to change behaviors. You're oftentimes, it's no longer the adversarial way it used to be. Now it's much more along the lines of, you know what, I would like to invest with you, but I need to see X, Y, and Z happen. And oftentimes, frankly, they're willing to do this and they're excited to do this because you're helping that you're effectively giving them free consulting and a roadmap that they can utilize, and there's a payoff in the end. So as we think about this, let's think about intention. Now, there's a number of different ways that you can begin to invest using racial equity, okay? So one is the economic empowerment. And this is what I was saying that you can say when you're talking to your committees, what level do we want to have? What is our intentionality at this point? This might be the toe in the water part of this. So getting buy-in, this is what, remember earlier when I said, making sure you're asking your committees, what tools can we use in our toolbox? And effectively what it is like, how far can we go in this? How far are you expecting us to go in this? So the first piece is, in fact, that you're starting to look at who are our partners, who are, investing, who are the people investing our money, and how are they looking in a diverse way across their management, their ownership, and their practices. And you can look at that and actually specifically do that. So for example, the Grosvenor Fund. The Grosvenor Fund is specifically looking to invest in minority-owned investment management firms to try to do this. So And then they're not emerging investment managers all the time. They oftentimes are seasoned, but they have had a hard time gathering assets because of it. The next is influencing the asset management industry. As far as, looking at this, I would say that, ask the question. You all have the power. And what that means is that I promise you that if I get an RFP, and that RFP is asking me to tell them about my diversity plans, tell me, how much I've committed to this, and I keep getting these questions, let me just tell you, it goes to our executive committee. We sit down, we figure out what we need to do and how we're putting it in our budget for the next year. That is a regular business, normal thing. And if you're asking us that, ask your managers. If your managers know you care, they will start putting this into their program as well. It is just the way business works. is really what it boils down to, right? So ask the question, push it, and actually think about it. The next thing is that you should be saying, what are you doing, but also what are your plans? So, I would say that the piece for us as a firm for our own advocacy is that I feel like the day we've really tried to move forward on a number of these things, the gap is so big. It is such a big thing to cover. It is not enough just to do a little bit. You constantly should be like, here's where we are. Boy, I want to get here, right? And you're constantly thinking about how you're going to get to that next step, because even though you might be above your peers, that maybe shouldn't be your yardstick. Instead, you should be thinking about all the things aligned with the values, the mission, the vision as part of this, as opposed to just your peers. So ask the questions, ask where they're going as part of this, and actually set parameters of what you expect from them. You tell them, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I expect. And then the last but not least, the societal impact, which I'll talk about next. This is where, beyond the asking others and choosing to partner with those who share your diversity and integration goals, but this in the next piece on societal impact is where you're actually possibly looking at different ways to invest. And now you're being much more intentional, and you're being much more active in the process of looking at this and what that could look like for the community. So here's an example of how different organizations have intentionally looked at thematic investing and putting that DEI lens into thematic investing. We don't appreciate that for those that are diverse, it affects every aspect of their lives, how they can access to housing, education, their workplace, and in fact, their health. And so this is not just a matter of investing in companies that are looking at these different pieces. In fact, remember earlier I was saying we have a bias in our industry, a built-in bias, which I'll talk about a little bit here, that I don't think was intentional. It was viewed as a best practice, but it creates barriers. It creates so that the people who already have made it continue to make it. And in fact, we need to be thinking about what might be doing that. So homeownership is a big one for housing. That is one of the earliest determinants of wealth, right? Education, access to education, economic growth is incredibly important. The hiring and income workplace advancements, the statistic that I just find amazing is that white men with a criminal record have as much of a chance of getting a job as a black man without a criminal record, okay? And so you look at what access there is on this, and it's really thinking through how you can be intentional in providing those opportunities. And last but not least, but could there be a better example than a pandemic to show the gaps in the ability to access healthcare, to be able to stay at home, having to work jobs, expose your family? I think that's been very much there. And we all talked about it, the distrust that's in the system associated with this, because they have not been served in a way that has been genuine in the past. And even though it may be genuine now, it's not. There's a natural, human, healthy skepticism when something like that occurs historically. So what does it look like in a portfolio? So I'll move on to the portfolio if there's no questions about this particular piece or any of these so far. Okay. And I can't see everyone on Zoom, but I'm hoping no one's asleep. So if anyone has anything to speak up, it's part of this. So one of the things that we look at is that clients often try to determine how are they going to do this. And And I will tell you in that early stage, you remember when I said that buy-in? So there's this learning and there's a buy-in. There are always normal, healthy skeptics going into this, and there is a wariness sometimes to just dive right in. They want to understand it. They want to see what it means. There can be real value in that, and I'll tell you why. Because we are just now coming onto common lexicon, like all the terminology. Oh my gosh, the terminology is a huge one, and we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go as it relates to when I refer to something, I'm meaning the same thing you're meaning. You know, instead, right now we really have to tease out what that is. So carving out a portion of the portfolio and having the discussion, sometimes what those initial investments can often tease out where you know. Me and Bob think we're on the same page, but when it comes down to it, we weren't at all because our scope is different, but we think we were using the same word, so we thought it's no different than when you're trying to determine out what's the real risk of a client, and you're looking at this, and your risk might be, you know, that you're a long-term investor, you're thinking all equities, and they're thinking, wow, you know, I want to make sure I don't lose anything, though, you know. And it's good to put dollars with it, right? Normal people aren't standard deviation people. They want to know dollars. And so looking at this, you know, the Knight Foundation, one of the pieces of study that said that the foundations that want to invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, about 13% of assets. That's been the historical amount, so about 13%. I often see clients starting to begin this with like a 10% carve out, okay? So there's 3 different ways to do this. Partial portfolio means, and this is what I'm seeing most often right now, partial portfolio means where possible, I want to start integrating this in the portfolio. So do I have an option, for example, to move some of my assets to diverse owned firm or diverse integrated firms as part of this, okay? And so wherever there's an opportunity, we try to take that opportunity. The next is that there's an actual carve-out. I want 10% of my portfolio that is going to be invested with a racial equity lens. And what does that mean? It doesn't have to be thematic. It doesn't mean to have to go that far, but it means that now it's being super intentional on what it means and what it looks like. And then last but not least, the total portfolio solution, we are just starting to see this really come into play. And that is that they're looking at ways across the portfolio where they can truly integrate racial lens investing across the portfolio beyond just, is it minority owned or minority integrated? You have to look at this and begin to look at what you want to do, and you should know for your clients how they're approaching it so that you can make sure that you're understanding what their objectives are in doing any of this.
Could you just compare this 10% of what I call the S in ESG to the other portions? So are they carving out 10% for environment? Are they carving out 10% for governance? How does that
in the ESG lens, so, and I would view, by the way, that diversity, equity, and inclusion often falls in the G, right? But it can also be societal and sustainability and what, right? Okay. Yep. It depends on what their lens is and what their mission is. So right now, I think that we are going to see a huge push because of the net zero commitments that we have seen over the course of and with all the finally agreed upon research of all the global scientists that have come out and the actions and the commitments of cities and companies to be net zero, I think we're going to see a huge allocation of climate mitigation strategies, climate transitional strategies, and mitigation of stranded assets. So I do think we're going to see that rise from where it has been historically. I will say that I don't see a breakout of being more into E, S, or G. If they are ESG, they want to be ESG, or they want to be climate. I've seen that broken out, and I would view governance as being probably more along the lines of the DEI window, that part is broken out. So that is what I am seeing as part of that. And it's interesting because, you know, just talking about nomenclature again for a moment, it is interesting that people use ESG and DEI interchangeably when I would say they're like a Venn diagram. You know, there's elements to them, and climate and racial equity, for example, is huge because minority groups are disproportionately affected by climate change. So obviously there's elements associated with that we need to look at as we consider that piece of it. Other questions?
I don't know if you've seen this, or I just heard about over the weekend, but in St. Paul, at least, they could measure that inner city people didn't have trees in their yard, and there could be a 15-degree difference.
Oh, I hadn't seen that.
Yeah, it was quite shocking, just because they don't have the tree coverage. In the warmer months, they can be 15 degrees warmer than the rest of the city.
You know, I'll look that up because that really is interesting. But that's the kind of thing that, that you wouldn't think about, right?
Yep.
And the strain that it puts on and that sort of thing.
Yep,
So,
that's that overlap.
yeah. So the next piece then is there are investment considerations. I talked about bias, okay? And here's where some of the best practices that were put in place for very, very good reasons can create a significant bias. And so, again, I will just want to toss out there that the compromises that you might have to make or the considerations have nothing to do with return. Okay, so I just want to say that again. And this is also why we note that all of our managers go through our due diligence process and have to pass our financial return expectations. Okay, so having said that, number one, they may have a smaller AUM. So if you're a particularly large asset owner, sometimes it feels like, gosh, I'm making these small allocations, you know, that are they really moving the needle? And in fact, and that is a very realistic, there's a certain bandwidth. We all know that there's administrative hassle with investing, and so you do have to consider that, and we only have a certain amount of time in the day to evaluate opportunities. So you do want to try to put capital where you think it'll have the highest impact. If your goal is to create, though, better diversity, equity, and inclusion in the industry, in the environment, we may need to consider how much we allocate to this area, and we may need to carve out and think about what we want to do in that particular area, and recognize that until this really becomes more robust and until some of our unintentional biases are addressed, we might be looking at smaller asset sizes for our managers. Shorter historical track record. Just the very fact that we have the impediments that we do lends itself to the fact they might be shorter historical track records. Fewer operational resources, so we might see them outsourcing some of those operational resources or be more limited. And usually there are higher fees because in the beginning of investment management life, you have to pay rent. There's just fixed costs associated with what you have to do. Actually, maybe with the pandemic, you don't have to pay rent anymore, but you have to still make your mortgage. And so at the end of the day, there's some kind of payment so oftentimes we might see it be higher than that. So as a case study of what it looks like on implementing this via racial equity lens, what we've done is we've just taken the same kind of taxonomy for the impact, negative screening, kind of that integration, thematic, and shareholder engagement. And what we've done is we started looking at how do we think about each one of these. So on the negative screening, you know, obviously we could put ones in place where, you know, they are targeting certain industries that are disproportionately adverse to minorities associated with this. And here we identified like the private prison system, immigration detention industry, you know, that sort of thing that you can start looking at and saying that they are disadvantaging that. The next is what are the industry trends? So this is one where you could actually begin to say, this is asking the questions, and this is where most people are, of insisting, asking, and saying what they want. The racial equity thesis. Here's one where you may actually want to be thinking about investing in opportunities, business, products that can invest in communities, and where they are maybe addressing some of those shortfalls, maybe those structural impediments. And last but not least is engaging with companies where you are actually having conversations with them to affect change in this. We have taken this entire spectrum, and like, for example, for us, our engagement with companies, we actually do a day where we meet with any managers that want to come in. We actually talk about what are the impediments, what are we doing on this, what can we do better. We sit down and we have a round table where this year's been a virtual round table, but we end up having it where they normally actually can come to our offices and sit down, and we go through all these different pieces, and we try to think about what are the impediments associated with this. So, and then the other piece to this is we sit down with managers who may not be minority owned or minority led, and we sit down and we say, you know, this is a problem for us. We give every single one of our managers, we already do automatically an ESG score. Okay, so that's for everything we underwrite. So that doesn't matter if you want to invest with ESG or not, just part of our due diligence because we view it as a risk element. We are also rolling out a DEI score for every single one of our managers. And the DEI score reflects not just if you're minority owned or minority led, but what are your inclusion practices? How are you integrating this? Is this integrated into your investment process? And we actually sit with managers and give them roadmaps of ways they can improve. And that is what we need to see, is that we're not just dinging somebody and excluding them, but we're partnering with them for advocacy reasons to help them get to that next level and talk about what we consider to be best practices. The next piece is to start thinking about baseline and goals. So the reason why I think that we are starting to see real movement on this is we've been doing this for a long time. And I remember like 3 years ago, a client was like, you know what, I really care about diversity. I'm a little nervous, though, about having us officially do a baseline because they didn't want to have a problem. They didn't want to create a problem for themselves. They don't want to be in a situation where they find out they only have 3% in diversity, and now like everyone's going to know, and they're going to have to address, and there's going to be some newspaper article and all this stuff, right? So no one wanted to do it. So everyone cared about it, but no one wanted to measure it. Well, okay, that's a challenge, right? Now, actually, there's enough pressure for people that they are willing to do a baseline. They're willing to actually go through and do a baseline, and you can do this in a number of different ways, right? We have those where we actually go to each one of their investment managers, and we ask them the questions, you know, do you have these different things in place, right? So that now we're starting to get transparency. And by the way, just asking the question actually caused some of the managers to say, that's a great idea. We hadn't thought of it. We're going to create it, okay? So we've done that, you know, to get this for clients on the individual basis. The other piece is that, you know, there's the ratings themselves of the diversity score ratings. And we are encouraging clients to put a target into their investment policy. So now there's a real number that is in their investment policy. So for this diverse manager exposure, this was a health system that said their goal was to hit 10%. That is part of their policy. And it's hard to see on here. Yeah, see better up there. They actually, as of 6/30, are at 14.6. So very human nature. Our goal was 10. We blew through it. It's going to be part of their KPIs, of course, at the end of the year. And now they're actually asking themselves, how can they do this further? Okay. So putting real numbers is great. We need to be done with the I just want to do better. Okay. And last but not least, and then I'll stop so that we can all discuss and talk about our own kind of lenses, what we've seen and challenges we've had. And that is that you put a timeline and you measure it. So a timeline meaning that you have a game plan. Again, we're no longer in a world where we just say we want to do better. The way we do better is we set goals, we understand what it is, we have a process we have in place, and so we actually set up timelines with our clients about what we are going to do by quarter, which a quarter flies. I mean, it just flies, let me just tell you. And what it is, what we're going to try to accomplish by then, and then we actually produce how has the change been over time to implement this goal, and it's part of their standard book that we provide for them. And so if you measure it, you said you have a timeline, a progress report effectively, and you have measurement, we are really starting to see change. Because of this, I think the assets that are going to go into people who do this well, I think is going to be huge. It is something that I'm seeing across the board, and really, what I've seen is there are people who are passionate about this. There are others that are not passionate, but they think it's important. And then there are others that are like, oh, the latest thing I got to do, but they're doing it, okay? So no matter what, we now even have all the through because we have enough momentum, and so we really have an opportunity to do this and do this well. So I'll just pause there and maybe stop sharing. Let's see where I am here. Stop share. Okay. Oh, and you have my picture up there, so that's great. Okay, let's see if we'll do this. I'd love to hear from you all, what you're seeing and the challenges that you're having, or thoughts, or what you think are the next steps.
Hey, Casey, it's Rochelle. Can I ask you a question about the last slide that you were showing that was, it was a bar chart, and it was showing, it looked like diverse manager exposure from 1 year to 5 years later, or some sort of over a time frame. And just wondered if people are doing that by assets invested with diverse managers? Are they doing it by number? Or is that sort of what you kind of flush out? I know that you showed those pie charts with, percentages, and I'm assuming that's invested assets. But just curious if people are using, number of managers versus asset level exposure there.
So I'm almost universally seeing assets.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you what could be, there's a pro and con to that, Rochelle. So I'll just tell you up front what the pro and con is, and it just depends on where the client is in their journey. And that is that sometimes for the assets, they want to increase the assets, and so they can select index funds where, and we actually just worked with Drumline to create a commingled vehicle that endowments and foundations can invest in so that they can choose a minority manager as part of this, right? And so that's absolutely moving forward with trying to have diversity, equity, inclusion at a manager level, but it isn't necessarily maybe seeding a number of different managers across the spectrum. Do you know what I mean? And so maybe some metric between the two might be worth it down the road. I would hate that we see, I mean, everyone knows Ariel, everyone, you have these incredibly successful minority-owned organizations who are very, very good, okay? But then they get all the assets. And I'm not sure that it's creating the broader structure that we're hoping, the ecosystem that we're hoping to have. And so there is an element, Rochelle, you raise a really great point, of having a certain number of managers actually has real value.
So that's really helpful to consider as we're kind of designing our benchmarking, criteria and establishing goals around this. And maybe it's different by asset class, but I also think, to your point further, that this is about creating the pipeline. And so, hiring Ariel for their, that they've been around for a really long time. They, certainly check all the boxes.
Yes.
And they're super smart. But you're really not changing the dynamic of the industry or growing the pipeline.
And so, one of the things that, just to be thinking about then as, let me find the page up here, there we go, is that gets to that early stage of what do we want to do from what's your intentionality and what are your values, right? So what are you trying to accomplish in this so that you're appreciating what it is, right? So one might be, if it's to reflect the population, that is ideal, and this is great to see, and being in that kind of an being in that kind of an environment where you're seeding a large index fund is fabulous, okay? And by the way, one of my clients who did that, I also think that they added significant value because they were willing to be the seed capital to help fund one of those. And Rochelle, I know that you all have been very innovative in thinking through how to partner with managers to help further that along. And so I would just say that if you have opportunities that you might want to be thinking about not just investing with a manager, but possibly being willing to help establish like a commingled vehicle or something that enables them to attract other investors as part of this would be of high value, because now you're actually helping create and support an ecosystem where there's, frankly, it's just costly, and most of the time those operational costs can be really challenging to try to get off the ground.
Casey, that's a great idea, and I hadn't thought of that exactly, but it's not a far leap from what we've done in other.
I know, yeah, you guys have been really innovative in that. So I think that would be ideal. Other thoughts?
I have a question, and I would be really interested to hear how everyone else is approaching this, but something that has been very challenging
for us is trying to define diversity, because global diversity versus U.S. diversity could very well be two different things. And so, you know, the question of, is a, you know, Chinese male-owned firm based in Hong Kong, are we going to call that diverse in our portfolio?
Right.
So I'm curious how NEPC defines diverse, or how other organizations are defining what a diverse firm may be.
I can jump in, but I'd like to hear what others are doing too. So maybe I'll ask that first, because I know I've dominated the airtime. But are other people, how are they doing that?
I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah.
The way my world breaks down is U.S., emerging markets, developed markets overseas. So the diversity component is pretty much a U.S. thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the intention of this is to remove barriers for marginalized groups. And so I have a client who helped me think through some of that. See, what I love about this is we're all kind of learning from each other, right? I have a and they actually changed their language to marginalized groups.
That's
Okay.
that's a great idea.
Because you're right that and one of the pieces, and my firm's headquarters is in Boston. Boston is a ridiculously undiversified city. I'm just and actually I always joke that it wasn't until I actually started working for NEPC I didn't realize that it's like the U.S. caste system. Like, you know, it's like, you know, and so anyway, the minority group there though that everyone's like, we should not be counting this as minority is Asian. And the reason is because of the universities that are there, that it's a significant part of the population, and frankly, they're not a marginalized group, even though we would normally consider. So that really helped me see a lens of, our goal is to help remove structural impediments and to provide a way to close the gap economically in wages, opportunity, education, and healthcare. I'm not sure that is our target. And so being thoughtful about what that is can be really helpful in that, you know. So those are kind of different ways that I've seen. Have others seen a different definition or a different way to be thinking about it? Other questions or thoughts?
Well, I would just say in general, and we work with NEPC, they are our consultant and have done a great job of getting us going down this path. But the thing that we've done, which I think is helpful, is instead of having the entire board or the entire investment committee work on this challenging topic, we have a subcommittee that meets, and they in turn will go through all of this work and then bring it forward to the investment committee. And from there, it will go to the executive committee and our board. I think that is helpful for just the way we're structured. And then I think there needs to be an asterisk next to the timeline and measurement slides, because time goes fast and this is a cumbersome, non-black and white topic. And I have to tell you, Rochelle, I have quoted you so many times at the beginning of a meeting about this, and I'll say, remember, and I'll say, my friend Rochelle Gunn has said this, and it's direction, not perfection. Because honestly, you can get so caught up in trying to do it just right that you can't do anything. It's too big. So I probably owe you a nickel for every time I've quoted you, Rochelle.
Karen, I'm glad it's helpful.
Yeah, it is.
We can all quote you now, Rochelle, because I really do like that.
Yeah.
Other comments or thoughts?
Well, we have a small portfolio of socially responsible ETFs, and I do think there's a need to push that into our larger portfolios. I'm looking to the day when we don't have a socially responsible fund. Because, if this is just, in our experience, and we use DSI as, KLD 500 as our benchmark, but last year, for those who think you can't, make money on this or something, or you can't have positive alpha, the DSI beat the S&P 500, and it beat it by about 200 basis points. So,
and last year it was already off of a really good return, right? So we're talking hefty returns.
Yeah, we've had 40%. 3 years of great returns. In our socially responsible fund, and that's why we've seen increases in allocations toward it, because some advisors just point to the one with last year's best results and shift their money over, and it's not what we would advise, but it's working. So they've been on a roll, but my point is that DSI has been beating the S&P 500, so this is not a question of can it.
Yeah.
It does.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, and I'd be curious, Casey, as to what you think the dollars invested toward this whole DEI could be. You said big.
I know.
I'm
so
curious about dollars.
I looked so much for that number. I thought, because that's the hook. Wouldn't that be cool if I could say, look, from a business standpoint, from an investment management standpoint, this is the amount of money coming into that. Just imagine if you could have that piece. I can't find almost anything on it, right? I can find a lot on ESG, ESG and what's going into it and that sort of thing, but I cannot find DEI specifically. And one of the things that occurred to me is that there's a key difference between ESG and DEI, which is important as we think about, yes, we use the same kind of taxonomy as we looked at both of those, but the reality is that DEI, I think, is going to be the way it just works. It's going to be part of our DNA. It needs to be part of everything that we do, and it's going to be across our portfolio. ESG, as an intentional change on climate change, on sustainability, that might still be a carve-out. And so I think it's easier to measure a carve-out than something that the whole industry might be evolving to shift to, So but I could not find it. But you know what? I have feelers out to 4 other people who none of them were able to find stuff for me in time for this, and I will follow up with you if I get that number. Yeah, and so I know we've gone through time a lot on this right now, so I very much appreciate everyone staying on for this. If there's other things that you want to see or have questions, I'd love to learn from others what they're doing on this as well. And that's it. I appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you, everyone on the phone.
Thank you, Casey. It was awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you.